we learned about a key figure of the Republic called Robespierre and the Reign of Terror. In this video, we are going to learn about women's role in the revolution.
All right, so let's get right into it. We're going to follow their story, which is really a cycle of hope and tragedy. We'll start with their daily lives and the hardships that push them to act. Then, we'll look at that incredible moment, the March to Versailles. After that, we'll see how they got a brief taste of freedom, only to have it snatched away during the terror and repression. And finally, we'll talk about the legacy of defiance they left behind.
So, first things first. To really get why these women became such a force in the revolution, you have to picture what their daily life was actually like. It was tough.
So for most women, the women of the Third Estate, life was just an endless grind. They were working these jobs, seamstresses, laundresses, domestic servants, selling stuff at the market, and for all that work, they were paid way less than men. And then, on top of that, they had to go home and do everything else: cooking, fetching water, taking care of the kids, and, maybe the worst part, standing in line for hours just to get bread for their families. And this image, wow. It really brings that struggle to life, doesn't it? Just look at them queuing up at a bakery. You can see how grueling this was. For them, not having enough bread wasn't some abstract political problem. It was an urgent, everyday crisis. It's what lit the fuse for revolution. And on top of all that physical labor, there was just no way out, no opportunity. If you were a daughter of a noble, sure, you might go to a convent for some education before you were married off. But for the women of the Third Estate, nothing. No school, no job training. They were completely stuck. And it's that deep, burning sense of injustice that really fueled their desire for change.
So, you have all this simmering anger and frustration. The question is, how did it finally boil over into a full-blown uprising? Well, that takes us to one of the most incredible events of the revolution.
See, these women weren't just going to sit back and take it. They got organized, and this was a huge deal back then. They started about 60 different political clubs and even newspapers all across France. It was their way of making sure their voices were heard.
And the most famous of all these groups was the Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women. And let's be clear, this wasn't some place to just chat and have tea. No, this was a serious political force, and they were demanding radical, fundamental change.
So what did they want? It was simple, and it was revolutionary. They wanted the same political rights as men. The right to vote, the right to be elected to the assembly, the right to actually hold political office. They knew that if they didn't have a seat at the table, they'd always be on the menu. And all this political energy just exploded on October 5th, 1789. I mean, look at this. These are the women of Paris, and they are marching on Versailles. They are anything but passive. They're armed with whatever they could find: pikes, tools, even swords. They marched all the way to the king's palace to demand one thing: bread. And they didn't leave until they dragged the king and his family back to Paris with them. This single event, it completely changed the game.
So after all that, after literally changing the course of the revolution, you'd think they'd be rewarded, right? Well, no. The new Constitution of 1791 was a complete slap in the face. It officially labeled all women as passive citizens, which basically meant they had zero political rights. None of the rights they had just fought so hard for. But the fight wasn't totally over. They kept up the pressure, and for a little while, it actually worked. The revolutionary government passed some new laws that, for a brief, shining moment, genuinely made women's lives better.
Okay, check this out. For the first time ever, schools were set up by the state, and all girls had to attend. That's huge. Marriage was no longer something your father could force you into. It became a civil contract you had to enter into freely. Divorce was legalized, and women could file for it just like men. Plus, they could finally get job training, become artists, or even run their own businesses. I mean, this was a real glimpse of what freedom could look like.
But just as quickly as that window of opportunity opened, it was slammed shut. The Jacobins came to power, and with them came the Reign of Terror.
And this is the really wild part. The Jacobin government, the very people who seemed to be their allies, turned on them. They passed new laws that forced all the women's clubs to close, banned them from any kind of political activity. Prominent women started getting arrested. Some were even executed. It was a total and brutal reversal.
And how did they justify this? Well, you have to hear this. A Jacobin politician, a guy named Chaumet, basically argued that it was all about nature. He got up and said things like, "Has nature entrusted domestic duties to men? Has she given us breasts to nurture babies?" His whole point was that a woman's biological role was to be in the home, and that's it. Any woman involved in politics was, in his view, just unnatural.
But there was one woman who absolutely refused to be silenced by this. Her name was Olympe de Gouges,
and she was about to become one of the most powerful voices of the revolution, and one of its most tragic figures.
Yeah, her story really captures it all, doesn't it? The incredible intelligence and bravery of these women, but also the deadly risk you took by speaking out during the terror.
So back in 1791, the revolutionaries put out their big, famous document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The key word there being man. It completely left women out. So what did Olympe de Gouges do? She wrote her own version, the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen.
And her ideas were incredibly bold for the time. The very first article says it all. Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights. She argued that the nation wasn't just about men. It was a union of women and men, and that the law had to represent everyone, both male and female citizens.
Well, you can imagine how that went over with the Jacobins. It was way too radical for them. After she openly criticized the government for closing the women's clubs, they'd had enough. She was arrested, charged with treason, and in 1793, she was executed.
So even though the movement was crushed in its time, the legacy of these women was huge. Their fight inspired women's suffrage movements all over the world for more than 100 years. But here's the really staggering part. Women in France itself wouldn't get the right to vote until 1946. Think about that.
So the fight for liberty, equality, and fraternity had definitely started, but the story of these women shows just how long it would take to figure out who that promise was really for. In the next video, we will learn about the abolition of slavery in the French colonies.